We're constantly told that there's more and more fire in the world. No, there's not. We have very good data that shows we've actually seen a declining amount or fraction of the world burning each year. We've gone from about 4.2 down to about 3%. It's not such that the world is burning more and more. It's burning less and less. The biggest or the lowest burn was in 2022. The second lowest burn was in 2024. We need to tell people this.
Welcome back. We are looking back at some of the best bits from the ARC conference last week in London that we weren't able to fit into this fortnight's main episode of The Other Side, which, if you haven't seen it yet, is episode 403, and you can catch it on our YouTube channel, main show channel. Konstantin Kisin was not the only speaker that was concerned at ARC about inflation and poverty. Inflation and poverty are the big worries of the world at the moment, and it was touched on by many, many speakers. Those problems are caused by high energy costs because the cost of energy affects the cost of everything. Net zero has turned out to be, just as every conservative and free market liberal on the planet was warning while they were being shouted down by the brats on the left, it is actually now starting to kill people. It's kind of funny that the bureaucrat control left, as I like to call them, chose a teenage girl as their global figurehead on climate change. Remember her? The one that throws tantrums and screams, "How dare you!" at rooms full of people that are much older and more experienced and wiser than her, that she might want to pause and have some respect for instead of shouting at. Because the bureaucrat class themselves are a lot like ignorant, self-righteous, spoilt teenage girls. And if the grown-ups in the room don't take back control from these adult children that are running our governments and that sit in positions of power, we are going to be in even more serious trouble before you know it. Anyway, the popular climate scientist and author, speaker, and the president of the Copenhagen Consensus think tank, BJORN LOMBORG, was given a very clear message by the ARC organisers for his speech this year at ARC. He was told to tell us how we get growth back. Lomborg says to achieve that, we have to stop making bad climate policies and we have to stop with the climate doomism.
We have this idea that we can get by with less energy, but actually this is not what we see. If you take the amount of energy that countries have out this axis and how rich they are, it's very clear that you have India here, you have China here, you have the US up here. It's just simply very, very clear. The more energy you have, the more likely it is that you're going to be rich. Or to put it differently, to get rich, you need lots of energy, and to stay rich, you need lots of energy. There's just simply no low energy, high income countries. That means we need to get a lot more energy, not less energy. But one of the problems with climate policies is they drive up our prices, and often dramatically so, which means it's much harder to keep using energy.
British people now pay 3 times what they used to pay in real terms for their electricity than 30 years ago. The US doesn't pay more because they've maintained their access to cheap energy despite climate policies.
It needn't have been this, that the UK is now spending about 2% more of its GDP every year on electricity. That's a huge cost and an unnecessary cost. And of course, this drives down consumption. The UK actually uses less and less electricity per person since the early 2000s. Not surprisingly, if you have to pay a lot of money for electricity, you stop using it. Actually, China has gone past per person the UK. The world is just about to do that for the UK. And of course, the US just uses way more electricity. Why? Because you have cheap electricity. The UK has incredibly costly electricity. And crucially, and that's of course what we're talking about, it drives down growth. If you look at the growth rate in rich countries, the OECD, we used to have growth at about 4% per person in the 1960s. In the 1990s, we were down to about 2%. Now it's barely above 1%. Not all of this is because of climate policy, but certainly part of it towards the end is driven by climate policy. And so again, if we start getting this better, how do we get growth back? We need abundant and cheap energy. We know this. This is how you drive better and higher growth. That means we need to address the climate concern. There's a real climate problem, but there's also a lot of people incredibly worried about climate, and those are real too. We need to address this. This is how we do it. First of all, we need to tell people, yes, climate change is a real problem. It's not the end of the world. We need to tell them and show them that the current climate policies are not working. Then we need to fix this with innovation, fix it with adaptation, and fix it, surprisingly, with economic growth.
Lomborg says that the data on climate change shows that, yes, it is a problem, but it is not the doomsday disaster. It is not the end of the world that we're told it is.
Let's take a look at how many people die from climate-related disasters, floods, drought, storms, and wildfires. 150 years ago, we estimate that about 5 million people died from these climate-related disasters. In the 1870s, 5 million people died each and every year. This is an unfathomably large number of people dying. In the 1920s, about 500,000 people died from climate-related disasters each and every year. In the 1970s, half a century later, about 55,000 people died. And today, less than 10,000 people die each and every year. Climate change is not this all-encompassing fear that's going to drive us all to death. It's not the existential problem we're talking about. We've seen a decline of 500 times. And of course, at the same time, global population has more than quintupled. We've seen a dramatic decline in the risk of dying from climate-related disasters.
Wow. Nice how we've been terrifying our children unnecessarily for 20 or 30 years, isn't it? No wonder anxiety rates are through the roof in our culture. Scumbags have been overplaying the climate risk narrative to get more power for themselves and more money for themselves, literally terrifying our children that the world's going to end. Bravo, you great moral crusaders, you. Aren't you so virtuous? I'm getting a feeling I get about the teals whenever I think of them. The other side doesn't get more than $1 billion of taxpayers' money to bring you news from a centre-right perspective like the ABC does to bring you news from a left-wing perspective. In fact, we don't get a red cent from the government. We need voluntary donors and supporters like you to keep going and growing. And we hate asking for charity, so we've done a deal with what we think is the world's best VPN, virtual private network service. It'll keep you and your family truly safe without slowing down your internet speeds, and you can watch Netflix or other streaming services using your regular accounts with them as if you're viewing from any country in the world. And you can sign up for less than $3 a month and get a whopping 83% off the normal price. Just go to piavpn.com/otherside to sign up and get more info. That's piavpn.com/otherside. Lomborg's second inconvenient truth for the climate alarmist crowd is aimed squarely at the smug Climate 200 teal types, those motivated by the riches that await them by taking money from taxpayers and shoving it into solar and wind power projects. The Simon Holmes Court Climate 200 fundraising body funneled around $700,000 into almost every teal candidate's election campaign at the last Australian federal election. $700,000, about 3 times what most parties spend on an election in one electorate. So no financial motivation to tell a doomsday story and plant wind and solar as the great saviours there, eh? No, not at all. The world's going to end, but we can't have nuclear power. No, we can't have nuclear power. That'd be terrible. Think about this if you're planning to be so stupid as to vote for the Teals a second time at this coming federal election.
Solar and wind is not cheap when you need electricity 24/7. How do we show that? Well, take a look at this graph. We have the percent of solar and wind and electricity out the x-axis, so how much solar and wind are you producing out of your total consumption? And up this axis, you get the price. You would imagine, if you believe the green rhetoric, that as you get more and more solar and wind, this cheap energy forms, you'd get cheaper and cheaper energy. You'd also be incredibly wrong. We have data for almost 70 countries. This is what it shows. Very, very clearly that the more solar and wind you get, the more costly it gets. So you have China and India down here with little solar and wind and very low prices. You have US with a little more solar and wind and higher prices. You have the EU up there with much more solar and wind and much higher prices. And then, of course, you have those front runners, the United Kingdom, Germany, Netherlands, that have huge amounts of solar and wind and enormously high prices. And I'm sorry to say my native Denmark does the very best or very worst, right? It has the most solar and wind and the very highest prices. It is just not true when you look at actual data that solar and wind is cheaper and cheaper. It makes electricity more and more expensive. So we gotta recognize this is a green fantasy. There's no countries down here when people tell you that more and more solar means cheaper and cheaper. They're just simply talking against the evidence.
Net zero is costing the world a fortune. It's estimated to cost the planet 27 trillion, that's million dollars in the 21st century. Not in the 21st century total, every single year. $27 trillion every single year. That's like giving every single Australian $1 million every year. It's insanity. How many starving kids could be fed around the world and hospitals could be built for that money? No wonder Donald Trump is trying to force the Europeans to start spending more on defense and getting their energy needs sorted out if they're capable of promoting such a wasteful policy as net zero so hysterically and irrationally. BJORN Lomborg says the EU's share of that 27 trillion is actually 3.3 trillion a year. That's more than the cost of all core government services every single year in the EU. Let that sink in.
Just to give you a sense of proportion, the EU right now spends about 0.8 trillion euros on education. That's anything from kindergarten to universities. It spends 1.26 trillion on health. It spends 0.13 trillion on environment, 0.22 trillion on defense, and another 0.22 trillion on police, law, courts, and prisons. All of this is 2.6 trillion euros. We're proposing on green to spend much more, 3.3 trillion euros each and every year. This is both implausible, it'll drive us bankrupt, or at least close to, and it's not going to happen. The last bit I just want to talk about is how everybody tells us we're all going to go off fossil fuels. You're being told that fossil fuels is left in the past. We need to get on the renewables train. The train is leaving the station and we all need to get on board before it's done. There is no train, there's no station, there's not even a snack bar. This is not happening. If you look at the actual data, from 1971 till today, yes, it has gone down slightly from 87% to 81%. But it's absolutely ridiculous to believe that we're going to go to zero in 2050. Not going to happen. What is likely to happen is a slow decline. If we take the fastest decline, it'll probably be done in, 4 centuries. More likely, will be done in 9 centuries.
Now, one of the most important messages for Australians from BJORN Lomborg's speech at ARC, I think, was his insight around bushfires. We seem to have adopted a false belief in the Western world that bushfires and natural disasters are increasing because of climate change. Most Australians would probably say that's true because of the horror of the 2019 bushfires that we saw in the south of the country and all the things that they've been told by the media and at school. But it just isn't true.
We're constantly told that there's more and more fire in the world. No, there's not. We have very good data that shows we've actually seen a declining amount or fraction of the world burning each year. We've gone from about 4.2 down to about 3%. And since the late 1990s, we've had satellites circling the world every single 24/7, picking up on all fires. And what they show, very different from what you hear, is a decline of 25% or more. It's not such that the world is burning more and more. It's burning less and less. The biggest or the lowest burn was in 2022. The second lowest burn was in 2024. We need to tell people this. Of course, why? This is because people don't like fire, and so they actually make sure that there's less fire. This is not rocket science. We know how to do this. We do this all the time with adaptation.
Lomborg says that we need sensible climate policies that recognize that climate change is a problem, but one that can be managed with technology and with innovation. Cheaper green energy like fourth-generation nuclear power, among other things. getting energy costs down by 30%, and focusing back on abundant energy and growth. We can stop the impoverishment and the decline.
The Other Side with Damien Coorey is Australia's best independent news commentary show, bringing you up to speed on the issues that matter most every second Friday. In between, don't miss The Other Side Unplugged, as Damien comments on current news and conducts in-depth interviews with the people who matter whenever the need arises. Simply subscribe for free on YouTube by hitting the subscribe button and bell, so you'll be notified whenever we post anything. And to really stay in touch, check out our independent website at othersidetv.com.au. You can sign up for free there too, or join the exclusive side and help support our show for less than $5 a month.